afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of the Crux Alliance, and I want to officially welcome you to the Charging Ahead session on global strategies for bus electrification. I have a number of people to thank and a few logistics, so I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget, so give me a second here. We are co-hosting this event with the International Council on Clean Transportation, the ICCT, which leads the Crux Alliance work on vehicle electrification and vehicle policy, and with the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, ITDP, which helps cities around the world develop urban mobility systems for people and planet. We are also joined by our friends from the Drive Electric campaign, from the World Bank, from the U.S. Department of Transportation, and from New York Con Edison. So we'll hear from them in just a moment. And then I also want to thank our colleagues from the Regulatory Assistance Project and the Aspen Global Change Institute for both their support for the event. And of course, we are very grateful to New York Climate Exchange for this wonderful venue. We look forward to having many more events here as you build out these facilities. It's just a great space. So thank you. A quick word about public transportation. I love buses and electric buses. Man, they are the coolest. Every single presentation I do starts with a bus on the first slide. Because it's not just a climate solution, they are a social justice solution, they are an economic development solution, as well as public health and climate. And so I'm really excited about this marriage of electrification and public transportation. There is no greater work in our space. The Crux Alliance, just to give a quick note about us, we are an alliance of different organizations working on the electrification space, particularly in energy, and we focus on the top 20 emitting countries. We provide technical assistance to policymakers to help them essentially be bold in crafting climate policies for their sectors. Happy to talk more about that in the break and at the reception. So, logistics for today. We're going to have two panels. The first panel will highlight progress on bus electrification around the world. And then the second will dig into how we scale that progress and do even more. We'll take a 15-minute break at the end of the first panel. And then we will facilitate an audience Q&A after the second panel. So we'll do the first panel, take a quick break, come back to the second panel, and then open it up for questions. If you scan that access code for Slido, or that QR code, excuse me, that will allow you to ask questions through your phone, and we'll pull those up and present them to the speakers. I think that is everything, and then obviously at the end we'll have a reception. Okay, then with no further ado, let me introduce Heather Thompson. Heather is the CEO of the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. She has been with the organization in one form or another for a better part of 15 years as a board member and then as CEO. I've had the pleasure of working with her all those years. She has done work across the globe with ITDP to bring solutions to cities and policymakers. So I'm going to hand off to Heather to get us going on the first panel. Heather.
Thank you, Joe. Such a pleasure to be here. We were worried that not enough people would get on the ferry to get here. We know if it was a bus, you would have gotten here for sure, but a ferry is a little bit harder. We know we're all big fans of the bus, but now we're fans of ferries too. So thank you all for making the trek and being here. We do have two panels today, and before calling up the first panel, I'm just going to do a very quick presentation to set the context, which will be useful for both panels, and then we'll call the first panel up, and I actually will be moderating both panels. I have the privilege of doing that. So I wanted to start by popular demand in describing a little bit of some of the takeaways from a report that ITDP did in partnership with UC Davis in the run-up to the Glasgow COP26 that we had a few years ago. And in the run-up to the Glasgow COP, there was a lot of excitement around electrification, and hopefully if you can put my slide up, that would be great. Just two brief slides. So in the run-up to the Glasgow COP, there was a lot of conversation around electrification. And at ITDP, we were really excited to talk about getting fossil fuels out of the transportation sector, and certainly excited to see so much momentum around electrification. But we had one question in mind, which was, how far can we get to meet our climate targets with electrification alone? And so we worked with UC Davis to do some modeling. And essentially what we found as a result of that study is that we could not get to our 1.5 degree targets with electrification alone. But what it said is we basically can't get to our 1.5 degree climate targets with electrification alone. But really that needs to go hand in hand with an emphasis on making sure that our cities grow in ways that are not sprawling, that we keep our cities compact and dense, that we emphasize investment in public transportation and walking and cycling and the connectivity of all of those uses, so that essentially we keep the number of vehicles on the road to a minimum and electrify the rest. And you know, that is so important for so many reasons. As we know, we have a huge challenge ahead of us to electrify vehicles. We also have a huge challenge ahead of us to green our grids. At the end of the day, all of those vehicles need to plug into a utility grid that is green. And we're certainly making a lot of progress on all of those things. But having electrification and a focus on compact city development and public transportation really work hand in hand to make both of the sides of that equation easier. In the end, it allows us to reduce our energy demand by 40%. Reduce our energy demand by 40%. It also allows us to save $5 trillion in infrastructure by 2050. We not only looked at the well-to-wheel emissions in the vehicles, but we also looked at all of the emissions that are embedded in the roads and the bridges that we build when we create our cities, which is something that's often left out of the equation. So that really adds up to be a much more emissions-driven equation. So what you see here is kind of a summary, and what that modeling was based on is the business as usual scenario, which you see in the top left-hand corner, and then three other scenarios. There is the vehicle electrification only scenario in the top right-hand corner. In the left bottom-hand corner, there's no electrification, just a focus on public transportation, walking and cycling. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, you see the benefit of those two strategies working together, compact city development and electrifying all of the rest of the vehicles. The circle in the middle is what is our actual carbon budget, and the solid circle in the very middle is our carbon budget if we're going to keep within a 1.5 degree scenario. So you can see the only circle that is smaller than that target is this green bottom right-hand corner. So that's the only way throughout the world we can get to our climate targets. And we have since, this study was so popular that we have since done scenarios, roadmaps for other countries, including Brazil, India, Mexico, Indonesia, Africa, many of the places that we'll be talking about today. And the picture looks even more strident in some of those places. If you go to the next slide quickly, this is essentially the same story, but using a line chart to be a little bit more clear. If you're a climate nerd like I am, many of the times we use GHG emission line curves to look at our targets instead. Just to give you a sense of how this translates into certain countries' scenarios, because sometimes I think those numbers can seem overwhelming. If we're talking a place like the United States, most people think the United States is such a sprawling place, there's no way we can ever have that much density. Well, the assumptions under our model for the United States was assuming the type of density that you have in a place Los Angeles, not New York City. We're not expecting New York cities to be everywhere in the US. That's not possible. But density of a place like LA, that's possible. So it's not out of the realm of what we can do with regulations. To give another example from India, which I know we'll be talking about a lot today, the challenge is tall. What we have estimated that we need is 2 million buses, new buses by the year 2050, which would make it 360,000 new buses by the year 2030. But we're on our way to get to that point. We already have a tender of about 20,000 buses happening. So we'll tell you a little bit more about how these types of programs can truly reach scale and the kind of scale that we need. So this kind of says the same, looking at a line chart instead. Again, our carbon budget is within this blue area. If we want to stay within that, we need to be on the green line. The business as usual case, if we're just going along as we are now, we're going to completely blow that budget with the red line. And then this yellow and orange line show what we can get, again, if we only use electrification or only high shift, and it's really only that green line that gets us within our carbon budget. So again, with that as context, let me call my first panel to the stage, again, to tell us a little bit more about some of the cases from around the world and the progress that we're making. So I'll call onto the stage Monica Araya first. And if you can just come up as I say your name, that would be wonderful. Monica is joining us as a native from Costa Rica, but currently living in Norway. She's a senior strategist, has been involved in a lot of decarbonization and electrification efforts, including the National Decarbonization Plan for Costa Rica, and as an advisor at the Glasgow COP, and is an advisor to the Drive Electric campaign currently. So thank you for joining us. Let me next call Amit Bhatt to the stage, who is joining us all the way from Delhi, India. Thank you so much for making the long trip. He is the managing director of India for ICCT, with more than 24 years of experience working on public transportation previously with WRI. My colleague Clarissa Linka, the director of our Brazil program at ITDP, joining us from Rio, Brazil, also has traveled far away to be with us. Thank you so much to be here. And then last but not least, Francisco Posada, who is the Southeast Asia Regional Director and Senior Researcher Lead from ICCT. We've brought him into working on buses with us, but he's worked on a lot of vehicle and policy technology in the past. And you may know of Dieselgate, which brought a lot of the manufacturers, the OEMs, to the table to get cleaner. And Francisco was a big part of making Dieselgate happen, which is those of us that are nerds in the electrification space have a lot to owe to you to make all that progress happen. So thank you so much for joining us on the stage here today. So Monica, let me start with you, because you've worked in a lot of different places and have a really great perspective on the overview. So what kind of progress are we making in the electrification space? And I know you're a big fan of public transportation and buses, so maybe give us the big picture and then the momentum that we really see in the bus space.
Yeah, thank you. And before I say beautiful things about buses, I wanted to thank you, because you are the true believers in buses and electric buses at Climate Week. So we should take a photo of all of you. No, you are here in the chapel of electrification. So a few things. Yeah, please do. Yeah. A few things. I think one of the amazing things about electrification is that it is a very counterintuitive story, because many, many times we were told that in the big scheme of things, clean tech was going to happen in developed countries, and one day it would arrive in developing countries. And that is not what happened. That is not what happened. Why? Because the technology got started first and bigger in the South. So at some point, think about it, at some point, Santiago de Chile had more electric buses running and operating than any city in the US or in Canada or in Spain or France or Germany. Think about what it does to Chile to see that happening. So a few things are part of the story, where clearly you cannot put a bus in the street if it doesn't work. So the technology was working, it made sense economically. Another thing that happened was that mayors got involved. And I can assure you that the conversation when you're a climate person or you're a citizen activist, the conversation with mayors is very different than conversations with ministers of transportation. With all due respect to ministers of transportation, there are some champions out there, but in general, their imagination is around highways. And the mayors see people, see you, and they understand that your pain in the morning is that terrible commute, not only because of congestion, but because it makes you ill. So there was something really powerful, and I won't speak for India or other parts of the world, but I can tell you that in Latin America, it was so exciting when we started hearing the news. And then the other thing I also wanted to say is that, of course, in the scheme of things, and you know this very well because you operate in transport, but you also have a foot in the climate space, is that there was a bit of a competition between what national governments were saying, you know, we have a national plan and we'll do these things at a sectoral level. And at the same time, you would have forums where the mayors would be like, oh, yeah, that my target is actually more ambitious than yours. And there was which is fair game, right? Because we need a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. So the point with this is that, of course, the Paris Agreement was a common language that you found between a politician that had to think of a national decarbonization plan, which is very abstract and people fall asleep and they don't believe in it. Whereas mayors could say, oh, that means electrification is a better commute for you, is something you can touch. And so the final point here is that what I find that the story that needs to be told is that in Latin America, we would not have been able to do what is happening in Medellin, in Bogota, in Panama, in Quito, and many other places without the technology coming from China, because the technology is not coming from Europe, and it's not coming from the US. So I just want to put that on the table to give you a feel of how counterintuitive this was, and that is why now we are here, and I look forward to hearing more about others.
Thank you so much. Yeah, ITDP, we're an international organization, and for years we look for best practice from around the world on where to apply it. And my team members were calling me up from around the world of, we need to call in the European experts on electric buses. I was like, I don't think they're there. I don't think we're going to be calling any Europeans anytime soon. No, but the answers really are coming from all over the world. Yeah. Clarice, let me turn to you next. Brazil, traditionally a bus manufacturer, exporter, maybe a little bit late to the game, but coming in strong. Can you tell us a little bit more about the things that are happening in Brazil?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. My voice is like this today, so I'm sorry for that. I would like to thank you all for being here and for bearing with me, and to the Crux Alliance for this invitation. I think there is really an interesting momentum going on in Brazil, and it's great to share this if I manage to come to the end of the panel. But I think there is a big picture in Brazil that, of course, transport is one of the key sectors responsible for emissions. Half of the country's energy emission comes from transport, and this number has grown by 5 times in the last 5 decades. With all the recent extreme events in the country, we have also seen the government has been extremely aware that there is an urgent need to retrofit our cities and our urban systems. In the last couple of weeks, we had many fires and many droughts and heat waves. Cities like São Paulo had last week the worst global air pollution. And this is the reason why I have this voice today, no kidding. And this is increasingly our reality, which I think has been an important reason why we have seen this momentum going on with the big federal government push. So we have seen increasing funding and subsidy, which is a very important enabling policy, of course. So yes, mayors are important, but I think for a movement at this scale, we need the federal government involved. And public transport has been always understood as a municipal issue in Brazil. And so changing this approach is something important. In 2024, the country has allocated funding for over 2,300 electric buses in 61 cities. And we expect that for 2025, the government will maintain this level of investment, and probably by pursuing aggregated or coordinated procurement, which would really help moving at this scale. I think also there is a visible movement in the industry. So maybe we can hear more from the ICCT colleagues, but the e-bus industry is advancing very rapidly. Several manufacturers already have buses with the adequate specifications for what we need. The Ministry of Finance has pushed on an ecological transition plan. The Ministry of Industry with a new industry program, so there is 60 billion allocated by 2026 to catalyze the industry transition for green industry overall. And it is said, at least, that it aims to elevate the country's production for a sustainable transport sector as well. And I think there is finally the MOVER, which is an incentive program for the automotive industry, and there is a promise that by the end of 24, it will also, the scope of MOVER will also include heavy-duty vehicles, and we see it as an opportunity also to boost synergistic gains with buses, trucks, and private vehicles. So I think considering all the studies we have done, and other colleagues from C40 and other organizations, we expect that the country can electrify about 11,000 to 12,000 buses by 2030. So who knows that Brazil has a potential to become really the leader in Latin America, and I think this is always something important for the so-called Global South, to be a leader in change, in particular in places where we have such a dramatic social inequality and where solutions like public transport can really help us change the game. So this is what's going on right there. Oof, I managed to.
Thank you, Clarice.
Sorry.
The worst thing is she's like, I'm not ill. I'm really not ill. I just can't speak because of air quality due to climate change, fires in Brazil. So we're so sorry. Being Californian, I've felt the fire throat as well. The forest fires are definitely a strong signal that things are not right. Well, I'm so glad that you brought up Brazil. I think, seeing Brazil make a radical shift is huge, not only for Brazil, but again, it's a real signal for all of Latin America that really has always been a leader in public transportation and the use of buses. And also for bringing up the point on the equity issue, which of course I should have brought up to begin with. But, investing in public transportation is not only good for climate, but it is good for people. It is the most cost-effective way to move people around. Most people on the planet actually walk to get from A to B, but if they're going to take some form of transportation, it is most commonly the bus. So we need to keep that at the forefront of our agenda. Amit, let me turn to you next. Clarice mentioned kind of the desire to get into manufacturing of buses, and certainly that has been a huge driver for India to be a big mover in this space. And again, we estimated 2 million buses by 2050. That sounds like a huge number, But there's already a huge tender going on. So can you tell us a little bit more about the exciting things happening in India?
Yeah, I think, so a couple of things that have happened in the last couple of years, at least in India, which has really changed the whole conversation on buses and electrification of buses, right? So Delhi, the city where I come from, has about 2,000 buses running, all electric. And the plan is 80% electric by 2025. And we are looking at 80% out of 10,000 vehicles that they will have. And then Mumbai, another city which is looking at fully electric by 2030. So we are seeing cities after cities coming up with fairly ambitious plan for going electric, which is very different till about a couple of years back. Because on one side, a lot of cities had come up with CNG buses as a narrative that CNG being clean, which we know it is not. But I think there are a few interesting things that have happened which has really changed the whole conversation. So if you look at the whole public transport journey in India for last almost 2 decades, public transport had become synonymous with metro. And we know metro are important, but then metro alone will not deliver the public transport. And there's a lot of fascination for doing metro, even if it means 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers of metro project. And for whatever reasons, buses, though the numbers were in our favor, the image of bus has taken a huge beating in the last couple of decades. So politically, it's a very difficult sell, a very hard sell to do buses. But a lot of it has changed since the electric buses came into picture. And so I said, there are 3 important learnings which we have seen from India, and which is now we are seeing the massive scale which is happening. One, there is absolutely very strong push for electric buses for public transport at national level. So last year we came up with PM e-bus scheme, which before it came out was supposed to support all fuel types except electric. But when the scheme came out, it is only supporting electric. So massive shift. And this becomes the central government. Second, we have seen is that if you aggregate demand, you can drive down the cost. So what we have seen previously, a lot of cities will come up with tender of 50, 100 buses. And the OEMs will take them for a ride in terms of the price point. But once you are aggregating demand from, let's say, 8, 10 cities, and demand numbers are in 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 buses, you are really able to get a good deal coming out from the OEM. So I think demand aggregation is a very interesting case example from India, which has massively brought down the cost of the buses. And third is the support in terms of operations of buses. So somewhere in 2007-8, the country came up with financial support for procurement of buses in the JNURM program. And we saw that a lot of cities bought the buses because it was being supported by national government, but they were not able to operate buses because the bulk of the money goes into operation of buses. So now the government has come with a scheme where they are saying we'll not support you in buying buses, but we will take care of a portion of the cost that goes into operations of buses. So now the incentive for cities is to operate buses because that's where you're going to money. So I think with these examples, we are now seeing quite a massive scale-up of electric buses in India. And that is very important, as you said, not only from climate, public health, but also from equity conversations, because if you look at the workforce participation rate in many cities, in fact, it is much more lower than the national average. And one of the main reasons why we are seeing a lot of less women workforce participation is the access of transport. With public transport, we are seeing that also changing in Indian cities.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's so many people don't have access to transport, and women in particular, because of safety concerns, security concerns. So really paying attention to women, 50% of the population, more or less. If we can make sure public transportation is safe for them, it's a huge win for our mission. Francisco, let me turn to you next. Again, Southeast Asia Director for ICCT, and you were recently in Indonesia.
Yep.
Just returned. Can you tell us about some of your observations as they ramp up e-buses in Indonesia?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of interesting developments are happening right now in Indonesia and also in Southeast Asia in general. We had a couple of conversations that were very eye-opening about the impact of the electric bus transition and how the transition to electric buses is opening the door to also considerations of electrification for other segments that are also very important when we're looking at the pie, the greenhouse gas pie that you were showing on the heavy-duty side. So, because the city of Jakarta has shown so much leadership pushing for electrification, there is a sense that the technology is available, that is there, that is it is a reality, and that is opening the door to basically the transition to heavy-duty vehicles, the consideration for heavy-duty vehicles. And what they want to see is also demonstration projects, these type of demonstration projects translated to other technologies. So we have a very productive conversation with the Ministry of Energy on that regard. They want to see, they saw what is happening with Transjakarta. The electric buses are fulfilling the operational needs that the old diesel buses use or are generating, are able to deliver today. So there is that sense of confidence in the technology. So the conversation about let's say one of the main challenges for bus electrification is the technology. That barrier is coming down dramatically. There is no more concerns of if the technology can deliver. It is proven that it can deliver. And the second consideration is that it is also opening the space for new businesses opportunities. So now there is an organization, a company that is building electric buses in Indonesia, and is being part of the latest procurement processes. So recently, Transjakarta ordered 200 more buses to join the fleet of about 70 they have right now. A fraction of those is going to be produced by this local Indonesian company, so that we can talk about jobs and economic development within the country, which is also very important, maybe similar to the situation in Brazil, where there is a local automotive industry that can benefit also from that transition to electric buses. So that's let's say the highlights is. They also mentioned the challenges still to increase or to accelerate. The city has a target for 100% electrification by 2030, and at the national level, the Ministry of Transport has a target of 100% electrification by 2040 of 40 main cities, 45 rest of the country. So they have ambitious targets for electrification, and that's it is doable as long as a couple of barriers on the policy side and on the financial side. The total cost of ownership of the electric buses is still difficult. We have been working as technical advisors with ITDP as well as partners, advising Transjakarta, advising the city on how to address these points in terms of reducing the TCO by extending the contract duration for these electric buses, or have preferential contracts for electric buses, which actually is an idea that came from Latin America, because it's a story of new business models for electric buses in Latin America. So that also points to the beneficial aspects of having this type of conversations where south to south type of communications can be very helpful for the new regions.
Great, and maybe we can draw upon some of those examples as we try to exchange lessons. But yeah, total cost of ownership is one of the big questions, right? And is an electric bus cheaper or more expensive to run? In general, cheaper if the business model underneath is set properly, right? So a big question there. But one of the common things that I think is coming out is there's a lot more confidence, maybe almost complete confidence in electric buses now. Just a few years ago, cities were saying, not me, someone else. And now we have so many cities and governments knowing that they work, that there's now more of a rush to see who can be the lead manufacturer, right? And we're going from support from the big cities and the big capital cities to some of the more small and medium-sized cities. So certainly momentum is coming. Monica, can you maybe share some of your observations on some of these points and advancements that you're hearing about?
Yeah. So as I was saying before, there are things that are very counterintuitive. And another point that is that was not very obvious at the beginning is that, at least in climate terms, we say, industry, energy, transport. So we have these these boxes and communities of thinkers and experts around them. But one of the big surprises when we started seeing so much happening in Latin America was that some of the most passionate people about electric buses were in ministries of energy, because they are thinking their homework is to remove the nasty, terrible, horrific fossil fuels that we have to get rid of. I mean, who wants coal? Who wants gas? Who wants oil? This is the past. The lobby is very active, but we know it's the past. And so you have this beating heart of these people saying, oh, okay, think about it. If your country does not produce oil and you have renewables in your country, for example, Costa Rica, why would you import oil when electricity can do the job? Why? So there is an economic argument, there is a climate argument, and that is not necessarily a transportation argument. Clearly, the transportation people have to think about commutes. So it's like a concert, it's like an orchestra, and then they start playing, and those start playing, okay. The other surprise was that you had this kind of almost condescending arguments. Oh yeah, but developing countries, they don't even have grid, and it's the charging, come on. I was in so many conversations where there was this dismissiveness about these countries ever getting smart charging right. People are smart, they can figure it out. In Chile, when they had to first figure out the charging solution for 100 buses that could charge, because they had to have the buses ready for the commute, so otherwise you can't get people waiting. They figured it out. And so the other point I wanted to make was that who wants to sell electricity? The utilities. Ching, like the dollar signs in the eyes, like, oh, this can increase demand for electricity. So they started developing a very organic incentive to figure out a lot of the charging solutions because they wanted to make money. And back to Francisco's point that, business, and then we can do this, and then we can figure this out. So I think there was this sense that the ecosystem was not just the bus company or the ministry or minister of transportation, but it started getting bigger and better. And so I find that in the countries where we need to help because these things are going slowly, we need to be very good at what can activate the dynamic, because sometimes in Egypt, for example, the activator was the solar producers who said, if we need to sell more electricity, electrification will make sense. So we need to be very dynamic in understanding what can trigger the interest. And it's not necessarily, just to close the point, it's not necessarily that you will always, in every single country or city, will start with an argument on transportation. It can be a different entry point, and it can be quite fertile.
Interesting, and I know we referenced the Santiago, Chile model, I think already, where that was the big investor, right? Was the energy sector, the utility, and so certainly those types of models can drive a lot of change. Clarissa, you kind of give a little bit of reference to some of the thinking of the changing around the business model. I don't know, maybe that or some other things that you see that we're borrowing from other countries and applying to the case of Brazil that are really moving things forward?
Yeah, sure. I think there is one important point that it's quite obvious for us, but I think for the cities is an important lesson that we are trying to take it further, that we're not talking about just replacing vehicles. Of course, we are talking about building a whole new infrastructure, engaging new players like the energy sector, and rethinking the system overall, right? The 61 cities in Brazil that had their request approved by the federal government to procure buses, the majority of these cities, they did not, and they stated that they did not have a comprehensive understanding about what was needed in terms of investment for the electric charging strategy and how the charging strategy would impact the operational plans, right? So I think there are many challenges, and it's really a great opportunity for us to rethink about the public transport overall. In most countries, this has been, in Brazil, I can say, precarious service, really losing passengers. So how can we use this opportunity to reposition the system? And ITDP has been really at the center of this effort, trying to connect all these different stakeholders, identifying all the bottlenecks, and identify the capacity building needs. For example, recently we conducted a capacity building training. We had WI and ICCT also as partners, helping these cities that have now to procure on, and based on lessons and on best practices from elsewhere, on thinking, on understanding, okay, what are the bus standardization requirements that we need? What is the national content rules for compliance so that these buses can be bought with the federal funding? What is the technical knowledge needed for developing bus specifications for different cities? Modeling the public bid for this type of systems as well, definition of the charging strategy, operational plan, revisions, and fleet management. I think also there is a second lesson, which is quite obvious, and I think we've been talking about demand and about the supply side as well, the industry side, which is having the demand alone. Even if it's clear, we understand that it might not be completely enough, right? I mean, mandating a transition in a specific city concession, for example, São Paulo has a bus concession. It's the largest bus concession in the country with 16,000 buses. And it has a specific set date, electrify half of this fleet by 2030, the complete electrification by 2038. And this was possible because there was an alignment with the city's climate plan. But there are some challenges, and we see how the need to integrate the local content into the bus production, with the manufacturers meeting a minimum percentage of local components, makes the process much slower than what we expected. So the demand is high, it's clear. Supply capacity theoretically is there, but it's still slow. So we need to see how we can support the cities on that. And I think there is one last point, which I think connects a little bit to one point mentioned by Monica, but it is an opportunity for us to see this as investments in areas that, like in poor areas, in peripheral areas. So in countries like our countries, like Brazil at least, where we have a gigantic social spatial mismatch between peripheric areas and central areas, but where the majority of users are in the periphery, they are much more exposed to pollution, right? Because they use much more of the system, they spend long hours waiting, that's where most trucks pass, that's where the bus depots are. So these are the areas where we need to prioritize investments, but normally these are areas that lack adequate grid. So how can we ensure that this investment is really enough to also help us deal with this historic inequalities that we have in our countries, right? I think this is great. So it's an opportunity really to revamp the public system overall, and it's not about maintaining that same system and just changing the vehicles and having the same precarious, expensive, poor service system. No, it's about using it as an opportunity to revise the system altogether and make public transport something cool again and a backbone of our cities. So I think this is a crucial lesson that we are getting from other places, but I hope also we are exporting it.
That's great. Yeah, I think we spoke a couple weeks after the government had done this assembly of demand from the cities, and I think you were even surprised to hear that 61 cities throughout the country were truly interested in e-buses, which is huge. And I think that is, reflects an underlying demand for public transportation and for modernization of the fleets. I was in India just after some of the first electric buses in the country had been launched in Pune. And there were lines waiting to get on the bus because it was a clean, new, nice bus. And usually you're kind of shoving yourself to get onto the next available bus, but people were choosing to wait because they were air conditioned and nice. And it was a way to really make people feel dignified for being on that ride. But Amit, if you would maybe talk a little bit more about this whole idea of aggregating demand and it's been a huge demand in India for so many buses. How does that translate to thinking about job creation? Is the manufacturing keeping up? Is this bold vision that the government has, is that working? Maybe tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we have learned is that, so roughly, if you look at about 2.3, 2.4 million buses we have in India as of now, and out of which 7-8% is with public agencies. So all the schemes that the government is bringing, whether it is the FAME, the PM E-Drive, or the PM E-Bus Seva, is only catering to this 7%. Now, if you have to really transform the entire bus story, we'll have to figure out what do we do with that 93%, because that is all privately held. So it's school buses, it is employee transport, it is contract carriage, and it's a huge, and there are informal buses as well, and that's again a different ballgame altogether, right? So what do we do with that 93% is going to be very important. Now, what we have done with the 7% definitely has a very strong learning to influence the next 93%. So there are three important things that has come out. One is that I think we are now beginning to see that electric buses are now being perceived as a catalyst for change for public transport reform. So because there are some inherent problems with public transport, right? So for example, if you look at revenues, 35-40% is what we recover from fare box. Where do we get the next 60-65%? Whether it is electric bus or normal, that's going to be a problem, right? That's one. Second is manufacturing is a major issue right now in buses, conventional buses and also electric buses. So how do you then work with OEMs to kind of look at developing supply chains to meet the demand? Because on one side there's electric, but there is also gas, there is also diesel, there is also flex fuel, there is also hydrogen conversation happening, right? So how do you so I think what we are seeing now is private sector is now coming up big time in the electric bus space as well. And there are two reasons to it. One, there is a regulatory issues in India where bus transport in many places is a monopoly business with public agencies. So for example, if you are Bangalore, if you want to run a bus, you will not be allowed to register a bus because it's a monopoly of the public agency. But if you have electric bus, you are exempted because electric does not require any permit. So now we are seeing private sector coming in with electric buses, and there's a huge demand which the public agency is not able to provide. So a lot of intercity buses are being run by a private sector. That's one. So using regulatory issues to push for electrification is coming up. Second, we're also seeing that while if you're able to manage the upfront cost, the OPEX is very low. So which means you have an asset which is expensive, but if you're able to sweat out the asset, then it makes economic sense, right? And third, we are seeing a lot of innovative business models which are coming up. So for example, charging becomes a very major issue. But one of the private OEMs, which runs from Delhi to Jaipur, it's about 250 odd kilometers, have tied up with a small a restaurant. And what it does is that a bus stop for 30 minutes, all the 60s people get down, eat from the restaurant, and the restaurant gives charging free for the buses. So he's also figured out the way of how to address charging issues. So we are seeing a lot of these innovation happening, but the great thing which is happening is electric buses have brought back the bus conversation back in the game. which we've been missing for the last many years now.
That's amazing. I love the micro enterprises. Everybody gets off the bus, goes to the restaurant, and you get free charging. It's great. Full circle right there. Francisco, let me last turn to you. And you mentioned earlier a little bit also about the manufacturing and some of the supply chain issues. Indonesia has historically been a bus bodybuilder, as I understand it, but they're also now sitting on some valuable minerals, want to be the battery producer of the future. So how does this all come together in Indonesia and thinking about policy that can bring these interests to help our mission?
So Indonesia is sitting on let's say the 50% of the world reserves on nickel. Nickel is one of the main components for battery production. So there is a strong interest from the government to capitalize on that massive reserve of minerals to make it in a sustainable way. That's something that we have been stressing to them, and they are very, very conscious about it. Of course, there are challenges, but they feel that they can do it in a sustainable way. There is a growing interest in developing a national electric vehicle supply chain. So all the way from the mining to refining to battery production and electric vehicle manufacturing as well. Right now, it is a combination of Chinese and Korean investments. They are coming, they have the technology, they are electric battery manufacturers, and so they are the ones who are starting with the technology already available, and the vehicles are built in Indonesia. So we see a company like Hyundai right now in Indonesia is selling 20% of their vehicles are electric, which is a huge share of their market. This company that we approach, that is a leading company in electric bus manufacturing, is using Chinese components to, they bring the CKD, the complete knockdown components, and they build, the bus directly in Indonesia with these Chinese components, and they see that there is a business case to be made. They are looking not only at buses, they are looking also at trucks. There is a huge interest on mining trucks. The reason for mining is because they don't have the issue of fuel subsidies. So fuel subsidies apply to on-road vehicles versus off-road equipment. They don't have access to that type of subsidies. So the business case is there already, like from today. They can, it's more cost-effective to own and operate an electric truck for off-road operation in a mining operation, a plantation, than a diesel vehicle today. So this is opening possibilities for the electric transition. Another interesting aspect is on two-wheelers. So two-wheelers in many global south countries are also part of the public transport ecosystem. They are serving as Ubers, basically, so ride-hailing services. So there are big companies right now in Indonesia and Southeast Asia that are investing in providing the ride-hailing services with electric motorcycles, where they will install battery swapping stations. Very convenient. Just takes a few minutes to get the motorcycle again running, and they basically lease these vehicles to the operators to great success. So they have been growing in numbers. Right now there are 2,200 such battery station systems in operation in Indonesia. A lot in Jakarta, a lot in Bali. Bali is one of the more progressive leading regions in Indonesia for electrification. So these are some of the examples of electrification that are happening as well, not just on the production, but also on the other phases of the public transit electrification. Taxis, the biggest company, Bluebird, is also investing in electric taxis for services. So there are cases here and there that start popping up, showcasing the potential of this technology to be yeah, the basis of the technology in the future.
The future. That's
Yeah.
great. Yeah. I think it seems to me Indonesia is kind of pulling a card from the deck of China on policy. China, as we all know, is the leader on electric vehicles, and they really focused on investing in their public fleets first. So their taxis, their ride-hailing fleets, and most importantly, their bus fleets. And that really is what enabled them to advance their battery manufacturing sector, which all sectors now have, and even countries are benefiting from that. So yeah, it's great to see Indonesia taking that lead. We need to wrap, but I want you, please, each, to maybe just give us the one sentence on the thing that you think is necessary to get towards even greater progress on electrification. In no particular order, whoever has a burning idea to share first. Monica, I see it formulating.
We need to connect this conversation with the conversation of ministries of finance, because there is not enough money and there will be a lot of competing asks, but this one is one that meets climate, it meets social justice, it meets so many others. So I think we need to make the case, and the case is this: stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Use that money for public transportation that is electric and dignifies people's life.
Great.
Yeah, I think financing is probably the biggest bottleneck to scaling up, especially when you look at private sector. So one is the high upfront cost, but there is also a favorable, unfavorable risk-reward ratio. And then there's always a question of what happens with the resale, with the prices coming down of batteries. So the asset, so I think how do we unlock the financial bit conversation is going to be very important for private sector uptake.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, of course, finance, but I think adding to that, we need to really push our countries to adopt more ambitious goals, climate goals. I think that at least in the case of Brazil, lots of organizations from the civil society is really looking at that. I mean, we need to be more ambitious and also think about public transport and active transport as a climate solution, not only to mitigate, but also to adapt our cities to the new norm. The new norm is full of extreme events, right? We are gonna be experiencing extreme events week in, week out, different types of extreme events. We had already a couple this year in Brazil, very dramatic. So how are these systems also gonna be helping us adjust our cities to this future scenario?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I will double down on the fuel subsidies, because that is exactly the main barrier that is preventing bus electrification in Indonesia right now. It's about 50% of the price of the diesel is subsidized right now. Is way too much. And if they remove that, the electric bus is 7 to 8% more cost effective than the diesel, like at the current prices of the electric buses today. So in a couple of years, with cheaper batteries, it's going to be really, really a good business deal and address the business issues. Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you all. You know, despite some of the challenges mentioned, there's so much reason for optimism. There's confidence. The money is coming. The procurement is there. The demand is there. We just need to take that money that we know exists and turn it in the right direction. So thank you so much for your great examples. We're going to take a 15-minute break and then come back and focus less on city examples and more on kind of the underlying interventions on policy, finance, connection to utilities. So we'll continue the conversation, but please, there's some refreshments in the back. If you have any questions that you wanted to add, please use the QR code to do that. We're going to turn to the questions at the end of the second session. Thanks so much. Thank you so much for coming out to Governor's Island to join us. I think some of you all might have missed the intro that we gave, so I'm just going to give a really, really quick synopsis of where we started, and then I will introduce our second panel, which we're so happy to have here with us today. And in the first panel, we covered more places, some exciting momentum that's going around in places. And in the second panel, we want to dig in a little bit more to some of the underlying challenges and solutions that we're facing around the planet and some of the innovative things that are being done to address them through policy and finance. But again, just to set the context, I'm joined here on stage by a number of partners within the Crux Alliance, partners of ICCT and ITDP. My name is Heather Thompson. I'm the CEO of ITDP, and it's really my honor to moderate this session. I started with a quick synopsis of our work from a study that we did in the run-up to the COP 26 in Glasgow, where there was a lot of attention on electrification, and we did a study called the Compact City Electrified Study. And the short story of this study was we were asking the question of, could we get to our climate targets with electrification alone? And what we found was the answer was no. We could not just focus on electrification, but if we focused on electrification along with an emphasis on investment in compact cities, cities that were not sprawling, but instead were focusing on density and compact building, and we focused our investment in public transport, walking and cycling, that those strategies along with electrification could get us to our 1.5 degree targets. And essentially what that means is that we need to minimize the number of vehicles on the road and electrify the rest. And we know that that is a tall challenge. And here on this slide that you can see on the screen, for those of you that are in climate change policy, which I'm sure is a number of us because we're all here for Climate Week, we often look at emissions trajectories, and this this slide shows that the red line is the business as usual scenario if we don't do anything to act. The blue line and under is where we need to be to meet our climate goals. And that yellow and orange line, if we just do high shift alone or just electrification, we can't get to our goals. But it's only that green line that really allows us to stay within our carbon budget and get to our goals. So again, it's a beautiful marriage to have electrification working in concert, again, with investment in public transport, walking and cycling. And at the crux of all of that is electric buses, because that's really where electrification and investment in public transportation meet, which is why we're here today. So let me, with that as context and the importance of investment in electric buses, introduce my panelists. I'll start to my right here is Oscar Delgado. Oscar is the Heavy Duty Vehicles Program Lead for Latin America and India for ICCT. He also co-leads the ZEBRA program, which focuses on zero emission buses in Latin America along with C40. So a lot of knowledge on electric buses and momentum around electric buses to share with us. Thank you so much for being here. To his right is Anne Shikani. We're very happy to have Anne here with us today. She's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy for the U.S. Department of Transportation. And under the current Biden administration, there's been huge investment in public transportation and electrification through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, which Anne has been a big part of focusing on for implementation, both, of course, for climate change, but also for the great benefits that they bring to communities. So excited to hear more about how those programs are being applied. To her right is Nicholas Pelletier, who's the Global Director for Transport of the Global Department of the World Bank within the Infrastructure Vice Presidency. And the World Bank has been doing a huge amount of work around the world to really advance financing for e-buses as well as the infrastructure that underlies them. So excited to hear about that. And last but not least, really where the rubber hits the road and those e-buses get plugged in, we have Allison Kling joining us, who is the Department Manager of e-mobility infrastructure programs at Con Edison. And for those that who don't know, Con Edison is the electric utility provider for New York City and the greater region. So we have examples going from all the way from global to the U.S. federal department to the local situation in New York. So a great variety of experience to share with you all today. So again, thank you so much for being here. So let me start with you, Nicholas, since you really have a kind of a global purview and are seeing the trends in the e-bus space change. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the World Bank's experience in really going to scale with e-buses, some of the bottlenecks that you see around the world, and of course I'm guessing that you're coming at this from more of that financing perspective.
Thank you very much, Heather, and I'm very glad to be part of this conversation because we definitely observe a very clear trend globally in favor of electric buses. And I was listening with a lot of attention to the previous panel. I'm going to repeat some of the things that were said, and I can just concur with many of the arguments that were made. At the World Bank, we finance mobility solutions in the Global South. We work with government. We currently work with about 40 countries over the world on their e-mobility agenda. And that can range from many different things. I mean, from more upstream type of work. I mean, we have government approaching us to ask us, does it make sense to engage on e-mobility? Are we ready for it? I mean, was the decision tree to engage on those kind of policies? Or we have governments that are more advanced in their thinking, where they want to work on a specific piece of policy or legislation, or even they are even more downstream. They want to work on a specific investment program that can typically includes the development of electric bus, the acquisition of e-buses as part of a mass transit investment. So we through these various country experience and some of the examples that were mentioned in the first panel are countries where we are actively working. I can see at least three bottlenecks that have to be overcome when engaging on, especially from the perspective of a country from the global south on e-mobility. The first one is to make the economic case for e-mobility. There are a lot of counter arguments that sometimes are raised. Countries are not ready, this is too complex. First, we need to clean the grid before electrifying transport. I mean, there are all these arguments that have been raised. And so in order to respond to them, we commissioned a research study a couple of years ago, looking at a sample of 20 countries, and this was a very diverse set of countries, from more emerging, high middle-income countries down to very low-income, even fragile and conflict-affected countries. And the conclusion that we presented at the COP 2 years ago in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP 27, were quite interesting because when we monetize the benefits of electric buses, when we strip out all the fiscal distortions, and there are many, we found an economic rationale for two market segments of electric vehicles. The first one is electric buses, and the second one is 2- and 3-wheelers. Now, when there was a mention in the previous panel of the importance of 2- and 3-wheelers, because that's one of the way people move in the global south. It's informal, rickshaw, moto taxis. This is an important part of the mobility solution. And so in 80% of the countries that we research, there was an economic case for e-buses, and in 90% there was an economic case for electric 2- and 3-wheelers. So I think that bottleneck is kind of addressed. Now, the second bottleneck that we've been facing, I was also mentioned earlier, is this issue of the high upfront cost of e-buses. Now, obviously, The advantage of e-buses is you recover part of that investment during operation because the operation cost and the maintenance cost are lower. But you have to overcome the upfront cost. And I think there are some solutions to that, and the example of India that was mentioned earlier is a really, really interesting one. And I just want to repeat the ingredients of the India experience, because this is something that I think we need to bring to other countries, and we are trying to do that, especially big federal countries can replicate that. This aggregation scheme, instead of letting every single city or every single state procure their small batch of buses, if you aggregate that demand at the national or the federal level and then you tender this globally, I mean, you can generate really enormous economies of scale. No? And the second ingredient in the India model was the fact that those tendering were awarded based on the TCO approach. No? And that also, basically what India was asking to bus providers is bus operators is give me the annuity that you need to be paid in order to operate those buses over the lifetime. And the result of this was actually quite amazing, because for the first time, when they procured 5,000 buses at once, they were able to get below an annuity payment for the diesel equivalent. Now, so there are these kind of solutions that exist to overcome these challenges, and it's really, really important to disseminate them. And then the third element, very quickly, is the risk perception for e-mobility. There are a lot of private stakeholders, financiers, who consider that e-mobility is too risky, that the asset is not strong enough to be used as collateral. And so there are some way to overcome those bottlenecks, for example, by separating the ownership from the operation of the buses. I mean, that's what Colombia, Bogota, Rio have done. You create an asset management company, you buy the buses, and then you lease them to operators. That's one way also to mitigate that risk. No?
Great, thank you. Yeah, some really great examples, and I'm glad that you brought the India procurement model up. I think Brazil's already trying to copy that, and I think a lot of other countries are to bring the cost down. And then also this idea of a new business model where you separate the battery and the bus operations, and because they have different risk profiles associated with owning and operating them. So to separate them and finance them separately makes a lot of sense. Oscar, I'm going to turn to you next, because you also have a bigger world view, purview with your programs that you're working on. And maybe you can continue to touch upon this financing angle, but bring in a little bit of how policy needs to underpin this and how we can use policy to drive those programs forward.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Heather. Thank you very much to the Crux Alliance for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here and with these panelists. I'm going to seize the opportunity and get some free publicity for our ZEBRA program, Zero Emission Bus Rapid Deployment Accelerator. It's a collaboration between the ICCT and C40 Cities, which is a climate leadership group by the mayors. Some of them are here. And we have revamped our platform in which we track the e-bus deployments in Latin America along with the greenhouse gas reductions. So if you may go to ebusradar.org or just Google eBusRadar and take a look, I invite you to do so. So moving on to the question, how policy design could unlock finance. I guess I would like to start with the need to have a goal. Investors need long-term certainty and need a scale. Scale facilitates things. And setting a bold goal, it could be a country, a national level goal, or a city-specific goal that announces that internal combustion engine is going to be phased out at a given year, or alternatively we're going to have 100% zero-emission vehicle sales at a given year. That's a very powerful message, and that, let's say, is the writing in the wall that allows the ecosystem to develop. And it really activates the actor. It's like the activation energy to kickstart the process, let's say. So that really helps. As an example, for a nation, I would say, let's say we have soft commitments. Let's say we have, for example, the National Electric Mobility of Chile, the National Electric Mobility Strategy, has a target of 2035 for all transit vehicles, public transit to be electric, to be zero-emission vehicles. In some places we have laws. So in Colombia we have the 1964 law, which is a purchase mandate for the public transport systems to purchase growing quotas of electric vehicles, starting in 2025 with 10% and ending in 100% by 2035. And Colombia is working with a in a co-financing mechanism, so the nation subsidizes 70% of that cost. At a city level, we have Sao Paulo. Clarice mentioned the Sao Paulo example. There is a climate law that really helps because it's a law that needs to be complied with. So the concessionaires, the bus operators need to reduce 50% by 2028, 100% by 2038. They had kind of these great plans to electrify, and at some point the pandemic got in the way. But thanks to C40's diplomacy with the mayor got bold, and the city has banned the purchase of diesel buses to comply with this climate law. And the target is 2,400 buses by the end of 2024. We are not there yet. We're like at 200, but it's a really great step. A second, I would like to also mention the Santiago example. I guess Nicola mentioned the business model. So I guess the role of the government is to create the enabling conditions that reduce the perception of risk and reduce cost. So the business model in Santiago works wonders. Let's say that's the benchmark city in Latin America. 1/3 of the fleet in Santiago is electric now, and they recently issued their first ever tender that only allows for electric buses. And the business model really allocates risk to the entities that could absorb it better. So they have like the asset owner that has kind of the financial muscle and could negotiate better prices and better warranty conditions with the manufacturers. So this entity absorbs the financial risk and the technology risk. The operators are there to do what they do best, which is operate the buses, maintain them, and offer a quality service to ensure that ridership is there. Like we need quality because we need ridership, and that is kind of revenue for the system. And the government role is they are providing financial guarantees. So the investors, the e-bus purchasers, the asset managers, they have certainty of payment. And that really, really reduces the perception of risk and allows these to happen. Stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we hadn't touched upon that part within the Santiago model, so thank you for bringing that out. And, you know, we think about bus operators as being these huge, you know, established entities, but often they're quite small. You know, in some places, it could be a private operator that's a small franchise that maybe only has 2 or 3 buses. And so, you know, really thinking about ways to reduce the risks and bring them together with these bigger purchasing agreements is really, really important. Anne, let me turn to you next. Again, this idea of coming together on procurement is so big. I was in a small city in Colorado in the middle of the United States. I was just in a conversation with somebody that was kind of in charge of buses. They're very, you know, progressive, but they were a small city. They couldn't afford the buses, and they needed support from the government. So can you tell us a little bit more about how the federal government is unlocking more money to go to public transportation and electrification and how we're bringing those things together?
Sure. And I'm going to start first by just recapping something that I think is so important that you opened with. Your chart of, you know, electrification alone isn't going to get us there, and I want to plug a report to Congress that my office released this July that came up with the same conclusion. And we have a slightly different version of those charts and graphs, but it ties our economy-wide goal for net zero emissions by 2050, and it ties into that, and it really shows, especially depending on kind of the rate of electrification, you know, having transit, having biking, walking, having compact cities is so important to meeting our climate goals, and that's really going to bring down our carbon emissions from transportation much sooner. So I love that.
We appreciate that.
And then, yes, I think that one of the things that we have seen, actually, even though we have unprecedented resources through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act for transit, we know that there are really two issues that are kind of hampering our deployment of electric buses in the United States. And one of those is the procurement issue. We've had, it was kind of funny for me to hear the India numbers, because I was like, oh, hundreds, like that's kind of a lot. We have small cities like in rural Colorado who order 1 or 2 buses. So we also have, you know, like the New York area who I think ordered 800. So that was a very large order, but usually the bus order in the United States is much, much smaller. So one of the things that, you know, we came together with APTA, who's our public transit association, and a lot of the developers and the bus manufacturers with the White House, I think it was earlier this year, and we said, how can we address this procurement issue? And so in our most recent notice of funding opportunity for the Low-No program, which is how we provide grant money for bus electrification and low emission or no emission bus vehicles, we said, really look at group procurements. And we provided an incentive for applications that did take that into account. But more broadly, I'll speak to the low and no emission program and some of the other investments. Earlier this year, we announced $1.5 billion for bus purchases in the United States, and 80% of those were low or no emissions, which, you know, is just an unprecedented amount of funding, and we're really excited. It's going to be years of procurements, and really looking forward to a clean future for transportation in the United States, and we're really excited about that trajectory.
That's fantastic. 1.5 million buses, or $1.5 billion.
Yes,
there
yes.
we go. 1.5 billion buses wouldn't be
I
bad
have to
either.
pull up my numbers here. I have the number of orders, but the other thing that I will mention, though, that others have said, operations is really a gap. And while we have these really fantastic resources for purchases, it's 1,100 buses across 47 states. That was the 1.5 billion. But we don't have dedicated operations funding for transit right now. We did, through the CARES Act and the pandemic, provide some operational funding, which was absolutely pivotal to getting us through one of the most dire periods, you know, across the globe for the economy and for people everywhere. And I think that, you know, as we enter a new season for reauthorization, and as we're looking at additional electrification, reducing our gas tax revenues, and thinking long-term about how are we going to fund transportation, I think that, you know, thinking about it holistically and being creative is going to be incredibly important, and making sure that we are supporting transit and having high-quality transit service will ensure that we can make that really part of the future of a clean transportation system.
That's great. Yeah, I think, you know, underlying all of what we're doing on public transportation, so many countries have had a real downturn in ridership on public transport, which of course has led to less revenue and less money in the systems. But I think worldwide we are seeing public transportation ridership rebound, and I think also governments around the world are understanding how fundamental it is and how much it needs to be a national funding priority. So we're seeing a lot more conversations move in that direction, and I think we all want to be part of making that happen, which is great. But moving from the national big picture down to, again, where the rubber really hits the road and these vehicles have to plug in, Allison, can you tell us a little bit more? I mean, I think ridership on public transportation here in New York City seems to be completely back to where it was, at least certainly in Manhattan during Climate Week. There seems to be a lot of people here. But yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about the challenges that a big utility like Con Edison has in rolling out charging infrastructure and all of the things that you need to do to make zero-emission electric vehicles happen here?
Absolutely. And thanks again for having us. Always love these events in our hometown. So I'm with Con Edison in our e-mobility group. So my team is everything about getting charging infrastructure in, everything from e-bikes, rideshare, private vehicles, all the way up to trucks and buses. So just want to say I really like the framing about e-mobility as a holistic environment transportation system. The urban planner in me really appreciates that, and it's really important. So we've been, working very closely with New York City transit agencies. We've always powered the subway, but now we have kind of this new customer of the public buses. So one thing that's really been successful for us is pre-engagement with bus agencies. Heard a lot of the challenges that they're facing. Funding, how do I operate these? Where do I put them? Where do I charge them? This is really hard. If you think about just one depot, they have to figure out how long are my routes? What size batteries do I need in my buses? Can I charge them all overnight? Do I need to charge them on the way? When I come back, do I need a quick charge in the middle of the day? Can I charge them all overnight? What happens if a bus breaks down? What happens in the winter when I need heating? What happens in the summer? This is all very new, very new technology. So what's been successful for us is, as the utility, as we're also learning about what this load means for our system, what is the load profile of an electric bus depot? We have to figure that out so that we can plan for it. Is to talk to them about their plans. So we've been working with, the MTA and other customers, for the last 2 or 3 years about these plans. They might come in and do I need like one huge fast charger for every single bus? Or can we talk about load management, software solutions they can use for staggering charging? Do they put in a lot of infrastructure and spend all their capital dollars? And then what does that mean for operational expenses, which are often 2 different budgets for bus companies? So for us to understand the challenges that they're thinking there, and then to understand how they're phasing. So maybe you have an order for 15 buses just to kind of figure it out. But then you've got this capital plan for more and eventual, full electrification. The last thing we want to do as a utility is build for those first 15, do, an 18-month, let's dig up the street, let's put in transformers, and then they come back 5 years later and, oh, just kidding, that wasn't enough. Now we have to do it again and rip it all out. That is the worst case scenario. Not good for our ratepayers. It's not good for our customers. So really that pre-engagement, working with them as they learn and we learn, so that we can plan for not just 2025, but 2030, 2040, and how do we think about that? And I'll get to this at my next question, but not just at each depot, but for our system as a whole, so that we know about all these loads that are coming. So yeah, it's been a challenge, but learning about this whole new customer segment has been really exciting for us.
Yeah, I mean, just a few minor issues of really making it connect, right? I mean, I think one of the first things that we all seem to learn as a community is that there was so much focus on the buses and how much the buses were going to cost and what it was going to take to operate them, that there was not enough emphasis and investment in the charging infrastructure. And then we realized that we were having to replace one bus with more than one bus electric bus, I should say, replace one conventional bus with more than one electric bus because we didn't have enough charging. And so there's really, you have to think about, again, that ecosystem, that holistic ecosystem of your investment, and make sure that you actually have enough charging infrastructure in the right places so that you can maximize the investment that you've made in your actual fleets and that whole total cost of operation, but also the cost comparison between number of buses as well. And certainly this issue around operations, that your operations really have to change as well. You can't just come in and fill it with fuel anywhere. You got to really think about that. So Oscar, you were already bringing up some of these issues earlier. You touched upon the operation and the total cost of operations. So how are you seeing that these things are being addressed? You touched upon a little bit the difference of the business model, but maybe some policies and other things that are creating a stronger foundation for this shift.
Sure. Yeah, I guess one challenge that was, let's say, we work mainly in 4 cities, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Medellin, and Santiago, and we work with operators and with the transit authorities. And in some places, we really started from scratch. So the main challenge was a knowledge gap. How do I start with this? So one solution that we found was to be, let's say, really there, hand-holding operators and transit authorities, solving all the questions. And they come from multiple, let's say, sides of the spectrum. Let's say we have technology questions. Is this bus going to climb the hill? Is the range going to be enough? We have cost considerations. TCO is key. We had infrastructure questions as well. So our theory of change there was to identify a champion fleet per city and really dig into all these details. So we had to develop in parallel tools to support that. So we, let's say, developed tools to monitor buses, electric buses in the real world, to monitor their performance. We use that information to feed into our vehicle simulation systems that we need to identify or to estimate energy consumption of diesel versus electric over different routes. So we ended up having a really robust methodology to identify total cost of ownership per route for these operators. So they could prioritize which routes makes more economic sense, which route is feasible from a technological perspective. Then the question of the infrastructure arose. So we had to develop another tool for that. So we have like a depot sizing tool that, based on the constraints of the bus operations, the charging management, and let's say the power availability at the grid point of that particular depot that we want to electrify, how to size that. So all those questions, sometimes we don't need to answer because we rely on collaboration, because some of these questions have been, let's say, others have solved them. So we really see value on peer-to-peer collaboration between operators. We love Medbus in Santiago. They were the pioneers, and we always invite them to events in which we want to convince other operators that this makes sense, and they end up convinced. And we also facilitated peer-to-peer relations between cities. For example, Mexico City wanted to implement something similar to the business model that was applied in Santiago and Bogota. The conditions of the market were, let's say, not exactly amenable to that, but they figured out a solution. So that also really helps.
Excellent. Nicholas, let me turn to you next. I can remember being at a number of meetings in the World Bank where Santiago was really ahead and coming to describe, as you just said, their model to other national governments, thinking the same, asking good questions, and hopefully convinced, because they're doing a lot more work now. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of the trends, getting the incentives right. You alluded to a little bit in your first comments, but maybe to go a little bit more in depth on how the bank helps get those incentives right.
Yeah. Yeah, so first, the technology is still evolving very quickly. One of the key reasons why e-buses became so relevant is because the cost of batteries has been reduced by 90% over the past decade. And the expectation is that trend is going to continue. But for that to happen, there will be some conditions in terms of access to critical minerals, also the development of the recycling of batteries. Some of you may have read there was an article in The Economist last week that very soon we may be able to get most of the critical minerals from the recycling of batteries. So there is hope there. One of the examples that I would like to mention that we have in our portfolio of e-mobility investment right now is the case of the Dakar BRT, which is really a flagship operation because it's the first BRT running with electric buses on the African continent. And it entered in operation earlier this year. It's a beautiful investment. It works really well, and not only it runs with 150 electric buses, but on top of that, these buses are powered with renewable energy. So it's a fully transport and energy story. And now we are starting to work with Senegal on the second, the third, the fourth BRT lines in the future. So they really were convinced about the model. And you have other African countries, African cities that are looking at Dakar now. Abidjan will be next. The tender is ongoing right now. It will be very soon. We're going to have a similar story in Abidjan, Douala, Kumasi in Ghana. Many countries are looking. It's becoming viral now on the African continent. Now, the interesting thing with Dakar is that one of the arguments that really triggered the interest of the Senegalese government for e-buses is air quality. And if you look at China, if you look at India, if you look at Brazil, and that argument about how the technology can bring local benefits. Not only it's good for the planet and because it reduces GHG emissions, it's good locally for the people, and that's a very powerful argument to make for policymakers. Another argument, and I think Amit mentioned it in the case of India, is the benefits for job employment, especially if you can develop a local industry. Now, not every single country from the global south will be able to have a battery plant tomorrow. That requires some conditions to do that, but the assembly of some of these buses can not very easily, but you can think about developing a local industry for assembly. And it's even more true for 2- and 3-wheelers, which are even simple type of vehicles. So that's why you have countries like Rwanda that started to invest in the assembly of locally made EVs. And right now, the African continent, there are about 10 startups that are working in that business. It's growing every month. You have more than 100 in Southeast Asia. So that job and local industry argument, local growth is, I think, also very interesting. Now, in terms of the incentives, the charging infrastructure is very critical. And in fact, some of the research we did at the World Bank comparing if you have $1 of subsidy to invest for EVs, is it better to put it to subsidize the acquisition of vehicles, or is it better to put it in the charging infrastructure? And we found it's 5 to 6 times more effective to put it in the charging infrastructure. So, when you think about the incentive, the enabling environment, obviously the business environment, the business climate will be very key to, if you want to grab those jobs, benefits for your local economy.
Wow, that's a really interesting statistic. Thank you for sharing that with us. And is that in a report that we can find?
Yeah, we disclosed it about 2 years ago.
Okay, in that same
yeah.
report. Okay, so 5 to 6 times more helpful to have the incentive the subsidy go into the charging instead of the vehicles. That's really amazing. Allison, let me turn to you next because I think you were sort of alluding to some of that as well. Maybe you could touch upon a little bit more on the regulatory framework that can help you, and then also I think you were beginning to say something about some of the new customers and other things that you need to think about when you're, again, thinking about this broader ecosystem.
Yeah, and I don't know how many of you are like energy policy nerds like me, but this is actually a really exciting time in the New York State utility regulatory environment. So when you think about a traditional building being built, that takes what, 3, 4, 5 years. So for a utility, our timeline to bring all the power that's needed for that building typically aligns with the construction that customer is going to do. And that's the way we've kind of done business for, how old are we, 200 years? So with transportation electrification, that is much different. You can have the installation of, say, a DC fast charger station that has the same load as that skyscraper, but that can be built in 6 to 9 months. So that timeline is very misaligned with the amount of time a utility needs to maybe upgrade a substation or bring in feeders, all of that work. So for the last couple of years, we've been thinking about and working with our regulators on what's the right kind of regulatory framework that will allow us to design and plan and build. Right now, as a utility, we can only build when we get those firm customer plans. So, you come in, you give us a load letter, and we're like, okay, we know this is happening. For transportation electrification, that doesn't work because by the time, let's say, all the school bus depots up in the South Bronx that are all clustered within a 2-mile stretch, if they all come to us at the same time because there's a bus mandate, it's already too late. So the exciting thing, and I promise that it's exciting, is a proceeding called proactive planning in New York State that we had an order about a month ago from our regulators where basically the utilities can now propose projects where we know when and how much load is coming in, particularly in industrial areas. Medium and heavy-duty loads tend to cluster. It's almost like chunky peanut butter kind of spread over our service territory. We just don't know exactly when, but we know, in Maspeth, Queens, there's a lot of charging that's coming. So we now have a way to kind of ask permission to build in advance of those projects coming. So that's something that we're actually filing our first projects for that in a couple of months. So huge kind of shift for how New York State, and this is all over the state, all of the investor-owned utilities. So huge shift in New York State on the way that we'll be able to support these loads that are coming onto our system. And one of the ways we try to figure out those loads is talking to these new customers. So the bus depots, the garbage trucks, the fleet operators. When did a utility ever need to go talk to Volvo or Daimler? Never, but now we do. So really trying to understand their business models, what do they think about when they think about TCO, how do they operate, what are they thinking about, and then all of that helps them understand our system, and then it also feeds into this kind of proactive planning that we're doing. So in a year from now, I hope we'll have kind of more of an update on the projects that are underway, but it is pretty exciting here in New York.
Well, congratulations, and we hope to all come back in a year and hear about tremendous progress. But it's sort of like the reverse of success, right? If you get a great mandate and everybody comes with demand for your power sector, it's wonderful. But meeting all that demand at the same time is a tall order, a tall challenge. And And you're thinking about that on like the mega scale, right? So can you maybe say a little bit more about how you're really thinking across federal, state, city, industry, and this is all in an effort to really fulfill the broader goals of zero emission commitments by the Biden administration. So maybe say a little bit more about that as well.
Sure. So first, I keep thinking about your numbers there, and I had to look at my little grant summary, and I'm like, oh, I think that we kind of aligned with that. So I was mentioning it's $1.5 billion that we did for bus purchases, but our kind of flagship vehicle electrification charging program is $7.5 billion. So it is kind of a similar multiple there. There are a lot of other programs that we have that I could go into, but like figuring out what slice of which grant program is going to what is a little difficult. But yeah, I mean, thinking across the national, state, and local, one of the things that we've found that we just really need to do is provide technical assistance, because even if we provide the money, even if we provide both the charging and the vehicles, kind of figuring out how is this going to work has been really difficult. And so one of the assets that we have is our joint office. It's got both transportation and energy folks, and so we have absolute expertise, people who are deeply knowledgeable about the vehicles themselves and the charging infrastructure, and about procurement, whether that's for school buses or for, and our FTA team is deeply involved too for transit purchases, and working with the utilities, with the state DOTs to make sure that we have that holistic environment to deploy these resources in a way that will happen hopefully as quickly as possible and have the largest impact.
Super ambitious, wow. That's really interesting, that comparison. So maybe those of you in the audience looking for a rule of thumb, it is that 5 to 6 times maybe investment in charging versus buses. Like, don't hold us to it, but that seems to be a little bit of a common theme. Well, I know we're running towards the end of our session, and we wanted to give chance for the audience for some Q&A. So if you haven't yet already, please use this QR code to add a question to the lot. You can actually type in your own question. You can vote on the questions that are already here if you'd like those to rise to the top. But maybe I'll just start with this question that is at the top, because I think it kind of touches upon this point of charging versus fleet electrification. And the question is, which I think we're in so many places, we're in a transition, right? So how do you manage a mixed fleet with some gas, some electric as we're transitioning away? What problems do those pose? I don't know who's in the best position to answer that question. Allison, I don't know if you have anything to add there from the utilities perspective rather than the operations perspective.
Yeah, and it's so, we do also have a utility fleet of our own. So my team manages on our customers, but we are also transitioning our own fleet. I think this is pretty common actually for people to, they're not gonna like turn their whole fleet over, if they're not sure. So I think it's pretty common to just, kick the tires, as it were. I think the phasing from like a utility and customer perspective is, how do you do that phasing? How do you put it into your regular vehicle retirement schedule? So I think it's just tricky to figure out, but it seems to be pretty common for people to kind of put their toe in.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just to confirm that, and perhaps we can make a difference between a greenfield and a brownfield investment. No? So, for example, the Dakar BRT, I mean, that was a complete greenfield. So there you can start, from the start, go 100% electric. If you, in the case of Sao Paulo, that I think, Clarice, you mentioned earlier, I mean, the largest fleet in Latin America, 16,000 buses. You want to introduce electric buses. I mean, you are forced to introduce electric buses progressively, and I think they started by tranches of 1,000 buses as they have to renew some of the buses. And that's also a way to pilot, to learn from the from the experience. I mean, Lagos, which has been also one of the first BRT program in Africa, has introduced a couple of electric buses because they wanted to learn how to operate and what's the ecosystem they have to build around it. So yeah, that's how it works usually.
Anybody else? No? Yeah, I would just to draw on that, I think, it's so common that cities are just getting a few buses and trying it out. And usually it seems like a big question is where to put that first depot and acquiring the land for that first depot that is in a place that can easily be connected to the utility. But, usually it is a bit of a separate fleet, piloting things out, and then you move into these larger procurement programs where the charging and the depots, I think, become a bigger issue. And where are you going to place them and having this transition plan that allows for that. But it's very common. I think there's a lot of examples of success out there. Maybe I think there was another question here about what do we do with the batteries when we're done with them, with buses? And I think this is also an area that we're just exploring in the whole sector. Anybody have any thoughts to add? Oscar? Yeah, please.
Let's start, yeah. Thank you. I guess
after that life, you need to dispose of them. They still have value because you can recycle them. They have very valuable materials. So it is very, very interesting to figure out the economics of that. If it makes, when it makes sense to recycle, when it makes sense to use in second-hand applications, and there is a lot of entrepreneurship around that. And one thing I want to highlight is when we have been monitoring real-world performance of electric buses in Latin America and elsewhere, we still have difficulties getting access to data channels that the OEMs manage, but they don't broadcast publicly in the ECU system, in the CAN bus, around the state of health. So I always bang this drum of we need to mandate transparent sharing of the state of health of the batteries out in the open. That helps the second-hand market. That helps the transfer authorities figure out the durability of the batteries when they need replacement. It helps with warranties, etc. So I will run.
I think that's such an interesting point, and one to bring back to the business models, right? If the business model is that the bus operator is leasing the battery, then they don't have to worry about those calculations so much, right? They just give the battery back to the one who owns it, and they can worry about whether they need to recycle it or reuse it. And they're probably in the best position to do so because they own the batteries, they probably have all of that data, and they know what to do next. So I think that's one really important point to bring out there. And then the second one I think that is so interesting is as cities are trying out those pilots and buying those buses and then scaling their programs and buying the batteries, that they often don't know that in that negotiation they need to make sure that they have access to the data. So even the cities themselves often don't have access to the data, and so it's really hard for them to know how to improve their operations and the rest. And again, it's those contracts in the beginning where you have to get all the business models right, but also very simple things like access to data so that you can improve your fleet management along the way. So maybe some things to tie to the earlier conversation. Well, I can't see the questions on the screen. Oh, but I can see them here. I think this is a great another question for you all. To what extent are local governments and transit operators approaching bus electrification as a resiliency measure? So in the replacement of backup power sources, for example. Any thoughts on that?
I can start, and I'm sure we've got some great stuff to come out of it. We've actually funded a number of really fantastic projects that are kind of new bus depots that focus on electric charging that have mini-grid components and are actually part of a broader community resilience plan. So they really, one of them is just outside of Washington, D.C., where I'm based, and that neighborhood, that community experience just from, I'd never even heard of it before. It happened at a derecho, which is like really horrible downwinds, and it knocked out all the power lines. It was really, really, it's significant damage to that community. And after that, they said we need to increase our resilience. And this project ended up being one of the results. And we've been talking to several EV charging companies who are looking at putting in medium and heavy duty charging stations. And I have been encouraging them, they can actually access our funding for resiliency and work with their state DOTs who have significant resources now available for resiliency to fund those projects as part of a larger kind of holistic approach to transportation resiliency.
That's great. So bringing different streams of money in for the same thing. That's wonderful.
Yeah, just to add on to that, you can also, battery storage, it's hard in New York City. There's a lot of permitting for good reason, but we do see some developers trying to figure it out and really, getting their feet in, putting in battery installations. And even if it's for resiliency, you can also use it for load management. You can use it for demand charge. You can use it for demand response. So there's a lot of different value streams that you can stack on top. And managed charging is a whole other topic, but it can also work with that. So it's a really exciting technology. We have some programs to help fund it, so I'll throw out that pitch.
That's great. It really is amazing to see that, again, things are really coming together so quickly, and we're really moving into this future world that we were hoping to see for so long. Maybe one more question. I think it's a real practical one that has come up, especially in the last few minutes. Bus charging depots can be expensive from a real estate and land acquisition perspective. How do you encourage cities to allocate scarce land to EV infrastructure?
I don't know if this is really exciting, but through our Lono program, they are able to use the money from that for building out the depot. So it can be incredibly expensive to do so, but we do have dedicated funding that's available for it. I think part of it also is just working with cities to say we have these national goals for reducing carbon. How are you thinking about doing this? It's really part of a more holistic approach to kind of climate planning, but I am glad that we at least have some money carved out for it.
Perhaps one thought about this is the fact that the e-mobility agenda is pushing the transport community out of its comfort zone. And this is much more complex than focusing on a piece of hard infrastructure like building a road. And we need to build those synergies with other sectors. Certainly the energy and transport nexus has been growing as a result of this e-mobility agenda. I was in Pittsburgh at the Clean Energy Festival a year ago, and I was amazed to see that 30 to 40% of the agenda was transport related. So that nexus is going stronger. Also, between transport and finance, many of those solutions will come from the finance community, risk-sharing approaches, how do we lower the risk perception. And then the third, the collaboration that we need to build is on land management with urban, between transport and urban. So that's why it's a complex but also fascinating agenda that requires building those collaboration platforms.
Well, I might add one little tidbit, which I think is, it really brings, again, the whole idea of compact cities and electrification together, which is parking lots. There are a lot of parking lots in cities, and many of them are empty. And many of them are assumed to be full often when they're not. And when cities really look at the space that they have available in parking, often in central locations, it becomes an opportunity not only to provide less parking for cars, but also more space for public transportation and often depots and charging. So there's often a lot more space than is recognized, either in parking lots or even street side for charging along the way. Of course, that's not a depot, but it can be in-route charging, which is often critical for bus routes. So parking, parking, parking. Let's get rid of car parking and turn it into electrification charging. I think maybe just one last question.
Is there any sign that transportation systems operations are anywhere close to discuss how to reduce their embodied emissions, given the huge demand for steel and concrete?
I was just on an industrial decarbonization panel earlier today. I mean, it's a very different stream of work, but we do have more dedicated funding for this, and steel is an available use. So I'm looking forward, so we'll be announcing soon our state awards, and right now our city and local funding opportunity is open, so we're hoping really strong applications, and transit agencies would be able to procure, low carbon steel buses under this program, which would be great. So we are trying to provide that demand signal. How it all shakes out is still to be seen, but there's Anybody else?
I will say I know that with CRUFs, we like to look at the crux of where sectors come together. So this is some research that ICCT is doing, along with a little bit of contribution from ITP and some partners of ours, to really look at the embedded emissions in auto manufacturing and what their opportunities are for reduction. So stay tuned for some great insights from the CREX network that can hopefully influence your policy work in the future. Well, with that, which being a very thorny question at the end, which I think we absolutely need to address, because again, that Compact City Electrified report that I mentioned earlier really did look at the embedded emissions in, especially in our road building and bridge building, which is something that we often overlook, and it is so important. So that was a great question to kind of bring the whole holistic picture together. Thank you for being here, and thank you very much for my panelists, this panel and the previous panel.
on the road and the number of miles driven. And I think e-buses really sit in the middle of that Venn diagram, which is why we're focusing on talking about them today. I think the transition to e-buses, what we heard, especially in the first panel, is it's really been being led by the global south, and it's being led by cities, specifically cities in Latin America and Southeast Asia and India. So we look exactly where we are today. You know, the technology for e-buses is ready. We know it's cleaner. We know people like it better. We know the TCO, the total cost of ownership, is favorable and continuing to get better. And we also know that there's a huge demand for the technology. But we also know that, you know, there's still a lot of work to do. So the couple barriers that I sort of wrote down as I was listening to everyone, of course, we heard the financing issue. Still need to figure out how to finance these buses. The capital costs are higher. There's a lot of knowledge building that still has to happen with the fleets and the cities that want to adopt these buses. And of course, the charging infrastructure. So there's some other barriers, and that's another topic to discuss. But there's also solutions. Like, we know what a lot of the solutions are. We know that, you know, government, especially national level government, has a big role to play, putting in place regulations to ensure that those buses sort of have to a chance that buses could potentially be like feasibly the first sector to fully electrify many countries and cities, if not globally. So that'll be interesting. I was kind of we're gonna do a little poll to see which country you thought would be the first one to have a fully electric bus fleet. Can't do that now, so maybe that's another topic to discuss. So of course, we understand what the barriers are. We know a lot of what the solutions are, and just like with everything regarding climate, it has to just accelerate and happen faster, faster, faster. So that's really what we need to figure out next. Is like, we know how to do it, but how do we do it faster? Anyway, your experience